So, Prince William and Catherine have reportedly confirmed that Queen Camilla has been ordered to leave Windsor Lodge. And the way this entire situation unfolded is even more unusual than most people realize, because for weeks, Camilla appeared to behave as though the residence belonged to her permanently. She wasn't simply staying there or making use of the property. She was acting as if she had complete authority over it. She was approving costly renovations, removing long-serving members of staff, limiting which family members could enter, and presenting the residence to guests as though Charles had personally given her the keys for good. And at first nobody openly challenged her. That silence allowed her confidence to grow. But then Catherine reportedly noticed something Camilla never expected anyone to discover. Several personal belongings associated with Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had vanished from rooms where they had traditionally remained. They had not been misplaced, and they had not been requested by another household. They had been carefully wrapped, labeled, and transferred into storage, under instructions that appeared to lead back to Camilla's office. William had not approved the move. Catherine had not been consulted. Even other members of the family were unaware until one nervous staff member finally decided to speak. That single disclosure changed the entire situation. What had initially looked like ordinary redecorating suddenly appeared to be something much more serious. It looked as though someone was attempting to remove the identity of Windsor Lodge and replace it with their own authority. Portraits were relocated, guest rooms were reassigned, and family arrangements were cancelled without clear explanations. Staff members who questioned the decisions were reportedly told that the residence now answered directly to the Queen. Now, before we continue, if you're enjoying this royal breakdown and want more updates as these stories develop, make sure you subscribe and join us here at Crown Watch. It only takes a moment, and it genuinely helps the channel continue covering these stories. Okay, so Catherine didn't react with an emotional confrontation when she discovered what had happened. Instead, she chose something far more effective. She requested the records. Storage inventories began arriving, followed by renovation requests, access instructions, and written concerns from household administrators. One warning stood out clearly. Certain objects were not supposed to be moved without family approval. Camilla's office had received that warning, yet the transfer still happened. That's when William became directly involved. He learned that one sealed box contained an object connected to Diana, something he believed should never have been moved without his knowledge. For William, the issue was no longer about furniture, decoration, or room assignments. It had become a question of family history, palace procedure, and the boundaries of Camilla's authority. He wanted one simple answer. Who had authorized the final order? The paper trail didn't stop with a junior assistant. It appeared to pass through Camilla's private office, beyond two separate objections, and into a chain of instructions that treated Windsor Lodge almost like her personal property. And then the situation became even more complicated. Royal household resources had reportedly been used to finance changes that had never received the required approval. Suddenly, Camilla faced a problem that couldn't easily be explained by rank or ceremony. Catherine still tried to prevent the matter from becoming public. She reportedly sent a private message asking Camilla to return the removed belongings, restore family access, and pause the renovations until everything could be reviewed by the household. Camilla's reported response was firm. She maintained that Windsor Lodge was now under her authority. Catherine, she suggested, should concentrate on her own household. That response caused more damage than Camilla may have understood. Catherine had approached her privately because she wanted to avoid embarrassing Charles or creating a wider family conflict. Instead of backing away, Camilla reportedly dismissed the concern and continued forward. Within days, additional staff were reassigned. Another family visit was cancelled, and new instructions referred to the lodge as Camilla's permanent residence. But permanence requires documentation. When William requested the original occupancy papers, palace officials expected to locate a signed grant, a lease modification, or some written authorization from Charles. They found none. What they discovered instead was a conditional arrangement, one dependent on continued family approval and appropriate use of the residence. And hidden inside that wording was a clause Camilla's office had apparently overlooked. If the property, staff, or royal resources were misused, the arrangement could be withdrawn. By the end of that evening, William and Catherine were no longer simply questioning whether Camilla had crossed a line. They were gathering evidence to establish exactly what had happened. Catherine placed every warning, invoice, storage record, and cancelled access notice into a single file. William ordered a complete review. And somewhere inside Windsor Lodge, while Camilla continued behaving as though nobody could challenge her position, officials had already begun examining the clause that could ultimately remove the residence from her control. Catherine's first instinct was not revenge. It was containment. She understood how quickly a private disagreement could become a public spectacle, and she knew Charles would be pulled into the middle the moment Camilla felt threatened. So she chose the quieter approach. A private meeting was requested away from staff, cameras, and the people already whispering through palace corridors. The conversation was brief. Catherine raised the missing belongings first. She explained that several items connected to Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had been transferred without consultation and that the staff changes were beginning to interfere with family access. She did not accuse Camilla or issue threats. She simply asked that the removals stop until William and the household administration could examine the situation. Camilla reportedly refused to retreat. According to people familiar with the exchange, she responded with the confidence of someone who believed the matter had already been decided. Windsor Lodge, she said, was now under her authority. The staffing decisions belonged to her. The renovations belonged to her, and Catherine should concentrate on her own household, rather than interfere with arrangements she no longer controlled. That statement changed the entire atmosphere. Catherine had entered the conversation hoping to prevent embarrassment. Camilla appeared to interpret that restraint as weakness. There was no apology for the removed belongings, no willingness to reconsider the staffing decisions, and no indication that the renovations would stop. Instead, Catherine was left with what sounded like a warning disguised as a dismissal. Step away, or the conflict would become even more difficult. But Catherine didn't step away. During the following days, restrictions reportedly became tighter. A family visit that had been arranged weeks earlier was cancelled without a clear explanation. 2 experienced employees were informed that their positions were being reviewed. A guest suite, previously used for family gatherings, was reassigned for Camilla's private visitors. New aides reportedly began checking names at the entrance, even when those individuals had previously entered the lodge without difficulty. The message was clear. Camilla was establishing control before anyone could challenge whether she actually possessed the authority to do so. One employee described the atmosphere as increasingly tense. Staff members became reluctant to speak openly in shared areas. Instructions were sometimes given verbally and later repeated through private messages, rather than normal administrative channels. Some employees complied because they feared losing their jobs. Others quietly began preserving copies of documents. Catherine did the same. Every cancelled visit was documented. Every staffing decision was dated. Every access request was placed alongside the response it received. She collected storage lists, renovation notes, security instructions, and the names of people ordered to carry out each change. What had started as a family disagreement was slowly becoming a formal record. Then a former member of the lodge, staff came forward with the detail that brought William directly into the dispute. The renovations were reportedly not being financed entirely through Camilla's private office. Invoices suggested that royal household resources had been used for alterations that had not received full approval. Payments were reportedly attached to maintenance, categories broad enough to escape immediate scrutiny. New furniture appeared under the heading of necessary replacements. Decorative work was recorded as structural maintenance. Staff assigned to official duties were allegedly redirected to support Camilla's private arrangements. There was no longer simply a disagreement about taste. It was now a question of authority. When William was shown the records, He reportedly didn't respond with the explosive anger Camilla might have expected. Instead, he became quiet. He went through every page. He asked who had authorized the payments, who had reassigned the staff, and who had approved the storage of items associated with Diana. Each answer appeared to lead back toward the same place, Camilla's office. William then requested the original documents governing Windsor Lodge. He didn't want a summary or an explanation from an aide. He wanted the actual papers. He asked for the occupancy record, the conditions attached to it, the funding requirements, and every amendment connected to the residence. Palace administrators began searching. Initially, Camilla's circle reportedly assumed the review would confirm what she had been saying, that Charles had granted her broad authority, that her position was secure, and that William might object but could not reverse the arrangement without openly challenging the king. Then an archivist located a line buried inside the residence file. The wording did not establish permanent ownership. It did not provide Camilla with an unrestricted lease. Instead, it described a conditional family arrangement, undependent on continuing approval and proper use of the property. Beneath that wording was another reference, a separate clause. That clause wasn't about decoration. It addressed misuse, unauthorized spending, restricted access, and the authority to withdraw occupancy when family property was treated as personal territory. It was a clause Camilla's office appeared not to have fully considered. William did not immediately confront Camilla when the clause was discovered. He waited until the residence file had been compared with financial records, staff instructions, and orders concerning the removal of family possessions. He wanted every detail verified, leaving no obvious gap that could later be dismissed as a misunderstanding. By the time the meeting was scheduled, he believed he had enough information. Camilla reportedly entered expecting a discussion about administrative procedure. William made clear that the issue was conduct. He placed the documents in front of her, one after another. The cancelled visits, reassigned employees, renovation charges, access restrictions, and storage order involving Diana's belongings. Then he asked the question she had avoided. What gave her the authority? Camilla did not answer by producing a document. Instead, she pointed to her status. She argued that the residence had been placed at her disposal, that the household understood her position, and that Charles had not objected to the changes. In her view, that should have been sufficient. The king's private approval did not need to be documented every time a staff member was replaced or a room was changed. William disagreed. He reminded her that Windsor Lodge was not simply a personal gift. It involved family history, official expenses, protected belongings, and arrangements affecting more than one household. A private understanding could not override written conditions, and it could not justify moving objects connected to his mother without informing him. That was when Camilla reportedly changed tactics. She warned that continuing the dispute would embarrass Charles. A public disagreement over the lodge could make it appear that the king could not manage his own family. It could create headlines, increase tensions, and trigger questions about who truly held authority inside Windsor. The warning was calculated. William understood exactly what was being implied. If he stopped, the family could avoid a spectacle. If he continued, he risked being portrayed as the person creating one. He continued anyway. William ordered a review of every decision made since Camilla began treating the lodge as her permanent residence. Officials were instructed to examine occupancy, security, staffing, spending, maintenance, guest access, and the removal of belongings. Nothing would be accepted simply because someone had a royal title. Every claim needed evidence. Catherine became central to that review. She had preserved written objections from household administrators. Some warned that experienced staff could not be removed without consultation. Others questioned maintenance accounts used for private alterations. One message specifically asked Camilla's office to delay the movement of family belongings until their status had been established. The response was brief. Proceed as instructed. That sentence made the situation much harder to explain away. Camilla's office had reportedly been informed that there were limits. Yet the action continued. Additional records emerged. A security note listed people connected to William's household as having restricted access. A staffing memo described rooms, once reserved for family gatherings, as being under the exclusive control of Camilla's aides. An invoice included work requested before formal approval. Piece by piece, the pattern became increasingly difficult to dismiss. This wasn't one isolated decision. It appeared to be a broader system. The most revealing information came from an administrator who had attended an earlier planning meeting. Camilla had reportedly spoken about the lodge as though its future had already been settled. She discussed revised guest arrangements, a new staff structure, and rooms that would no longer be available for shared family use. When someone asked whether permanent authorization had been received, an aide reportedly answered that nobody would challenge the Queen. The entire plan had been built around that assumption. William's investigation challenged it. By the end of the review, officials had reached a conclusion Camilla had not anticipated. Her position at Windsor Lodge was not protected by ownership, a permanent lease, or an unrestricted royal grant. She had been permitted to occupy the property under conditions involving appropriate use, shared access, and respect for its family purpose. The documents also appeared to give household administrators the ability to intervene when those conditions were violated. William requested one final confirmation. He wanted to know whether the clause could be enforced without requiring Charles to sign a new order, and without obtaining Camilla's consent. The answer came that evening. It could, but another discovery accompanied it. Catherine's file showed that Camilla had received 3 separate warnings before the review began. Each one explained that her authority was conditional. Each requested that she reverse a decision. She ignored all 3. The palace was no longer asking whether Camilla had simply misunderstood the arrangement. It was now deciding what should happen when someone had been warned, understood the potential consequences, and continued regardless. The file William requested was no longer merely a collection of complaints. It had become a detailed map showing how Camilla's control had expanded, one decision at a time, while everyone around her assumed somebody else had authorized it. Catherine organized the material chronologically. First came the room plans, followed by staff schedules and storage records. Then came security instructions, maintenance invoices, and correspondence showing how objections had been handled. They were not resolved. They were overruled or ignored. One photograph immediately caught William's attention. It showed a sitting room before the renovations. Another photograph, taken only days later, showed the same room with several family pieces removed. Replacement furniture had already arrived. A new portrait had been placed above the fireplace. The room no longer appeared shared. It appeared claimed. That was the important detail. The changes did not look random. They followed a consistent pattern. Camilla's personal guests were given priority. Her aides controlled access. Staff members associated with the previous household were moved away from important areas. Objects connected to earlier generations were taken out of sight. Each change made the lodge feel less like a shared family residence and more like an extension of Camilla's private court. Catherine understood something at that moment. Camilla's earlier instruction that she should focus on her own household had not simply been an emotional remark. It reflected a larger plan already underway. Catherine and William were not merely being asked to accept new furniture or different decorations. They were gradually being pushed outside. A residence Camilla intended to control herself. The strongest evidence reportedly came from a long-serving employee who had remained silent until then. The employee had been present when the original storage instructions were discussed and had watched the older members of staff become increasingly concerned. Nobody wanted to challenge the Queen. Nobody wanted to lose a position they had held for years. But one particular instruction felt too serious to forget. The employee had secretly kept a copy. It was signed. The document instructed staff to remove several protected belongings and complete the transfer before the next scheduled family visit. The timing was important. It suggested the items were not being moved because of urgent repairs. They were being moved before. William and Catherine had an opportunity to see what was taking place. Then Catherine found the warning attached to the same paperwork. The warning had been issued 2 days earlier. It stated that the listed belongings required consultation and that no transfer should happen until ownership and family access had been confirmed. The instruction to remove the items came afterward. That discovery weakened the last plausible argument that the situation had resulted from simple confusion. The order had not passed through an overloaded office by accident. It had apparently been issued after the risks had already been explained in writing. The atmosphere within the review team shifted. Officials who had remained cautious began speaking more openly. The lodge had been treated as private territory. Royal resources had supported the changes. Family access had been restricted. Even then, Camilla's representatives attempted one final defense. They argued that Charles had given verbal permission. That claim pushed the review into its most sensitive phase. Officials searched for anything capable of supporting it, including a signed letter, lease amendment, note from the king's private secretary, or even a diary entry showing that permanent authority had been discussed. There was nothing. Charles may have allowed Camilla to stay at the lodge. That was not the same as granting ownership. He may have known she wanted changes. That did not prove he authorized the removal of protected belongings, the spending of household funds, or restrictions on family access. Private words could not automatically erase conditions recorded in writing. William then asked whether the occupancy could be ended without creating a fresh constitutional dispute. Legal advisors returned to the clause and tested it against every action recorded in Catherine's file. Their conclusion was firm. The conditions had been breached repeatedly, and the household possessed the authority to withdraw the arrangement. William and Catherine approved the next stage. A formal notice was prepared. It listed the alleged breaches, instructed that unauthorized work cease, returned control to household administration, and required Camilla's private staff to leave the residence. One final line made the consequence unmistakable. The keys had to be surrendered by a specific deadline. When the notice reached Camilla, the atmosphere inside Windsor Lodge reportedly changed immediately. Doors were closed. Calls were placed. Staff members were told not to speak. One aide insisted the decision would be overturned before morning. But morning arrived. Nothing changed. The deadline remained in place. And while Camilla's office searched for someone who might stop the process, palace officials were already preparing inventories, access instructions, and security arrangements for the handover. For the first time, the question was no longer whether she would leave. It was how she would respond. The deadline arrived on a Windsor morning, and the vehicle entering the gates did not belong to Camilla. It carried 2 household officials, a security supervisor, and an inventory team responsible for overseeing the transfer. No photographers were waiting outside. No public announcement had been arranged. The palace wanted the process. It completed quietly before rumors became impossible to control. Inside the lodge, Camilla's aides began packing. Personal files were removed from desks. Garment cases were carried down the main staircase. Framed photographs were wrapped and placed beside labeled boxes. One assistant moved rapidly from room to room, checking drawers and cupboards against a private list. Another remained near the entrance, demanding to know who had authorized officials to enter before. Camilla had completed her discussions with Charles. The answer was contained within the notice. Authority had returned to household administration when the deadline expired. From that point forward, no room could be kept closed for inspection. No item could leave without being checked, and no member of Camilla's private staff could remain after the handover. The officials did not argue. They read the terms and began. Their calmness made the scene even more uncomfortable. Camilla had expected resistance she could transform into outrage. Raised voices might have allowed her to accuse others of disrespect. A dramatic confrontation could have made William appear reckless. Instead, every movement was controlled. Every box was recorded. Every door was opened under written authority. The procedure gave her very little room to fight. Then the first dispute emerged. A collection of silver frames had been placed among Camilla's personal belongings, but the inventory identified them as part of the lodge collection. Her aide insisted they had been gifts. The officials requested documentation. None was provided, so the frames remained. A writing desk followed, then 2 paintings, and finally a cabinet containing correspondence from an earlier royal household. Each case was handled under the same rule. Personal belongings could leave. Family property could not. Room by room, the boundary Camilla had reportedly ignored was being restored. William and Catherine were not physically present. That was intentional. Their absence prevented Camilla from turning the handover into a personal confrontation. Yet their authority was reflected in every document on the table. Catherine's records had established the pattern. William's review had activated the clause. The officials were now carrying out a decision neither intended to reverse. Camilla eventually entered the entrance hall before midday. She appeared composed at first. She asked to speak with the senior official, questioned the timetable, and argued that the residence should not be surrendered while her discussions with the king were ongoing. The official responded that private family discussions would not suspend the notice. The deadline had passed. The occupancy had ended. That was when the restraint reportedly broke. Camilla accused Catherine of arranging the humiliation from the beginning. She claimed the questions about staff and storage had been excuses intended to weaken her position and make her appear like an outsider. Then she turned toward William. She accused him of using Diana's memory to punish anyone who challenged him. The room reportedly became silent. William's response had already been included in the handover instructions. The decision was not about punishing Camilla over personal history. It followed repeated issues involving access, staffing, spending, and protected family property. No accusation could change the documented record. Camilla rejected that explanation. She demanded that one private sitting room remain locked until Charles personally determined its status. Her aide produced another key and refused to place it with the others. For several moments, the process stopped. The security supervisor checked the notice while the senior official opened the complete occupancy schedule. Every room within the lodge was listed. There was no private exception, no reserved suite, and no continuing access after termination. The final defense collapsed. Camilla was informed that keeping the key could be treated as refusing to complete the handover. The official did not threaten her. He simply explained what would happen next. Security would open the room, record everything inside, and note that the key had not been surrendered voluntarily. The aide looked toward Camilla. She gave a small nod. The key was placed on the table. By late afternoon, the private vehicles were ready. Camilla's staff departed in stages, while officials checked every package against the inventory. The final boxes were loaded. The entrance hall became empty. At the gates, one vehicle paused briefly before continuing onto the road away from Windsor. Inside, silence returned, but the palace still faced one final decision. Advisors wanted no public confirmation. They believed the departure could be described as a routine change, and eventually allowed to disappear from the headlines. William and Catherine disagreed. Too many people already knew. Too many records existed. Silence could allow another version of events to take hold. That evening, they decided to speak, and what they were prepared to confirm would make Camilla's departure impossible to portray as ordinary. William and Catherine selected their words carefully, but the meaning was unmistakable. Camilla had vacated Windsor Lodge. Her private staff no longer controlled the residence. The keys had been returned. The unauthorized work had stopped. Household administration had regained authority over every room, account, and access point. The confirmation traveled rapidly. Inside palace offices, aides understood what the public had not yet been told. This was not simply a voluntary relocation. It followed a review into how far Camilla had allegedly gone while assuming that nobody would challenge her. She had treated the residence as permanent. The documents suggested otherwise. William did not celebrate the outcome. Instead, he instructed officials to begin restoring the lodge. Staff reopened storage records and began identifying every object removed during Camilla's time there. They worked from photographs, inventories, and previous room plans. Items associated with Queen Elizabeth were separated from ordinary furnishings. Objects connected to Diana were checked against William's records before being returned. One box remained sealed longer than the others. It contained the personal object that had first brought William directly into the dispute. The wrapping was still intact, but the label showed that it had been scheduled for transfer somewhere else. Had the employee remained silent, the item might have disappeared into a broader royal collection far from Windsor Lodge and outside the attention of the people who understood its history. Catherine observed the restoration without turning it into a public victory. For her, the outcome was never about taking a residence away from another woman. It was about establishing a boundary. Shared property could not become personal property simply because someone acted confidently. Family memories could not be removed from a room merely because they were inconvenient. Authority had limits even when the person testing those limits wore a crown. That principle was now reflected in the record. Long-serving employees who had been removed were contacted. Some were offered their former roles again. Others were asked to assist with rebuilding the household structure. Guest arrangements returned to neutral administration. Private aides lost the ability to determine which family members could enter. The lodge was no longer functioning as an extension of Camilla's office, but the outcome carried consequences of its own. Charles now faced questions that would be difficult to avoid. How much had he actually known? Had he approved the renovations? Or had Camilla used his name because she believed nobody would ask him directly? Did he know royal resources were supporting private changes? Most importantly, did he know that belongings connected to his late mother and Diana had been moved after written warnings? No clear answer came. The silence may have protected the king temporarily, but it did not restore trust. William had learned that family assurances meant little without documentation. Catherine had learned that private diplomacy could easily be interpreted as weakness. Camilla had learned that status could postpone consequences, but it could not remove a written condition once the evidence had been assembled. The balance inside Windsor shifted. Staff became more cautious about verbal instructions. Administrators began demanding written approval for decisions that had once been handled privately. Security teams reviewed who could restrict access to shared residences. The message was understood across the household. William and Catherine were prepared to challenge anyone who treated royal tradition as personal property. Camilla's departure therefore became about more than one lodge. It represented the moment her authority encountered a boundary. She could not simply move. She had believed Charles's position would protect every decision. She had believed Catherine would remain diplomatic. William would avoid scandal, and staff members would remain silent. Each assumption failed. The consequences were largely created by her own decisions. If Camilla had stopped after the first warning, the dispute might have remained private. If she had returned the belongings, reviewed the spending, or restored family access, William might never have ordered the investigation. Instead, every refusal added another page to Catherine's file. Every attempt to tighten control produced another witness. By the time the notice arrived, the case against her had been assembled through the decision she had made herself. By nightfall, the restored rooms had been inspected. Windsor Lodge was quiet once again, but the silence no longer carried the same fear. It was the silence that follows a confrontation, when everyone understands that the rules have changed. William and Catherine had not simply removed Camilla from Windsor Lodge. They had demonstrated that invoking Charles would no longer be enough, and that the next confrontation could carry consequences far beyond one residence.